Okay, and today we're going to look at Surah 41 entitled Ha-Mim. Now, this takes its title from the first two words of this surah, which say Ha-Mim, exclamation mark, exclamation point. And of course, this is one of the disjointed letters, the Muqatta'at, probably mispronouncing that, but basically the words that are arranged in a way that makes them indecipherable. And you find this in about a quarter of the Quranic surahs. Islamic scholars debate the actual meaning of these letters and why they precede these surahs. We don't have a really good explanation, but the title itself is interesting because this there was a prophet who took the name of this title, and he was a prophet. He was a Berber prophet from the from around the 10th century, who took his name from this title and declared himself a prophet, much in the vein of Muhammad declaring himself the seal of the prophets and an apostle of Allah. He did the same thing. He wasn't an Arab, he was a Berber, but he attracted a huge following. He attracted a huge following among the Gomera Berbers in this part of North Africa, and even bequeathed a legacy to his son. Unlike Muhammad, whose caliphate was um, fought over for years. Of course, his successor was Abu Bakr, who was his best friend, his companion, despite the fact that if you look at the relationship between Muhammad and Abu Bakr, the nom de guerre of the recently deceased head of ISIS, it wasn't really much of a friend. It was a very unequal friendship and relationship. But this prophet, who was the prophet of the Gomera Berbers, he declared himself to be a prophet, and he took the name of this surah. And I just wanted to make this point because Muslims are very fervent in their belief that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, that he's the last prophet, and they even deem other Muslims who believe that there was a prophet after Muhammad as heretics. And this is why the Ahmadiyya are so widely persecuted. In the nation of Pakistan, for example, they used to be able to hold office and be a very rich part of civic life, but they gradually became more and more persecuted. First under Ali Bhutto, the father of the late Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, but also subsequent to that under the military dictatorship of Zia al-Haq, and even to this day, Ahmadiyyas are not considered Muslims. Officially in Pakistan, they're not considered Muslims because they don't believe that Muhammad was the last prophet. So, um, but I just bring up this man because it's an example of all these the prophets, the false prophets subsequent to Muhammad, many of them Muslim themselves, who basically believed the same thing that Muhammad did, only they were less successful than Muhammad. Therefore, Muslims consider him to be the seal of the prophets. But there was nothing that Muhammad did that, or no truth claims that Muhammad put forward that couldn't be put forward by this man, or Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the founder of the Ahmadiyya, or any or the Mahdi in Sudan, the Sudanese leader who rose up in rebellion against the British and was defeated by Lord Kirchner. There were dozens and dozens of these figures in Islamic history who did the same thing that Muhammad did, only they were less successful. That's the only distinction between them and Muhammad. There's no, and if a Muslim tries to tell you that these people aren't prophets, ask them why Muhammad is a prophet then. What distinguishes him spiritually from all of his successors, Muslim and non-Muslim? So Ibn Khaldun quoted in an Arabic statement here, and this is referring to Hamim, the 10th century Berber prophet. O you who are beyond sight, who watches the world, release me from my sins. O you who saved Moses from the sea, you believe in Hamim, and this is a reference to the Berber prophet from Morocco in the 10th century, and in his father, Abu Khalaf Man Allah. That's Allah. So in other words, it's this statement is a reflection that his in his belief that he was a prophet in the likeness of Allah, that he was a prophet chosen by Allah. No, actually, it's the same. It's the same quality. I think it's just the time that I'm recording this. It's actually usually at night. The lighting is very of a very poor quality. So that statement by which was translated into the Arabic by Ibn Khaldun, it's a reflection that this man believed himself to be a prophet. He made statements to that effect and actually gathered a very large group of followers, just like the Mahdi in Sudan, just like Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, who is still followed and believed to be a prophet by millions of Ahmadiyya Muslims, both in Pakistan and those who are living in exile in North America and Europe. And there are huge gatherings every few years of the Ahmadiyya community, just like they have these gigantic conclaves of Jehovah's Witnesses. There are huge gatherings of Ahmadiyya, and Nabil actually discusses this in his memoir, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. These huge gatherings, and one of them had a very large impact on his life when he was younger, because he found two friends after asking Allah to reunite him with these two friends of his. He actually found them, and this strengthened his belief in Allah and in Islam. So, but he actually mentions this gathering in which there were hundreds of thousands of people. So there are still millions of people who follow Mirza Ghulam Ahmed and still believe him to be the prophet. There were thousands of people that followed Hamim, who actually took his name from this surah in the Quran. And just like there were millions of people who subsequent to that followed non-Muslim prophets, false prophets, who claimed to be prophets and provided no clear, convincing evidence that they were, just like Muhammad. So when a Muslim approaches you and tries to convince you that Muhammad was a prophet, ask him, how was he a prophet different from Hamim, the 10th century Berber self-proclaimed prophet? How was he different from the Mahdi? How was he different than the prophet who seized control of Mecca in the 1970s and declared himself to be the Mahdi? How is he different from any of these people? All of these people died. All of these people claimed for themselves. All these people were self-declared prophets. All of them died. None of them provided any concrete evidence that they were prophets, other than the fact that they attracted a large, the varying on the person, somewhere between hundreds and thousands and or millions of people. All of these people basically did the same thing that Muhammad did. They were not as successful at conquering territory and maintaining it. But then again, Muhammad, it wasn't assured that Muhammad would have been successful. Like I said, immediately after Muhammad's death, the caliphate began to break apart, and you had the Ridda Wars. And if the Muslims had not been, the followers of Muhammad had not been successful, we would have never, uh, we we would not have an ummah today. There might be scattered, isolated believers in Islam, just like you have Baha'i. You have a couple 100,000 Baha'i, but there wouldn't be no Islam as such, a global religion. So just ask them, challenge them, and say, how was Muhammad different than Mirza Ghulam Ahmed or the Mahdi in Sudan, or Elijah Muhammad, for that matter? How was he different than Orthodox Muslims consider the Nation of Islam to be heretics, but how was he different than Elijah Muhammad? Just challenge them, show them these Muslim prophets and even non-Muslim prophets, and ask them what distinguishes Muhammad from them. So, like I said, these were the first two words of the verse Ha Mim. And the second verse is a revelation from the beneficent, the merciful God, a book of which the verses are made plain, an Arabic Quran for people who know. So this raises the question, are non-Arabic Qurans pointless? And if they're pointless, then why are they published? Why do you have dawah teams and dawah channels try communicating to people in English? Why do you have people like Muhammad Hijab or Ali Dawa or Zakir Naik communicating people in English and trying to explain the principles of the Quran and the Hadith in English? If it needs to be an Arabic Quran, if the only legitimate Quran is one written in Arabic, then what's the purpose of English speaking dawah? What's the purpose of English language Qurans like this copy of the translation of the Quran by M.H. Shakir? Why are they published? Why are there millions of English language Qurans in print today? If it's pointless to have a non-Arabic Quran, why would you even bother? Now, the thing is, Muhammad didn't realize that his religion would spread beyond Arabia. All of the people he encountered as he was preaching his message spoke Arabic, so they wouldn't need to understand something that was not written in Arabic. He didn't know that there were English speakers. He didn't know that there would be that English would become the most commonly used second language and a language of commerce. Even though he was a merchant, he didn't know this. So everything he did was in Arabic. But today, where you have a religion that's spread over the globe, and even exists in places like North America and England, in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, you have to find a way to goad people into accepting Islam and to accepting this very unpalatable religion with its sets of bizarre demands and requirements and restrictions, and a book that is incomprehensible. So you have to find a way to communicate with these people, and you use the vernacular. But the thing is, the Quran emphasizes repeatedly its immutability, the fact that it's Arabic, the fact that this is some kind of blessing. Even though, as I said in previous videos, it raises the question: why is Arabic special? I mean, uh, the Arabs are not a huge part of the Bible. They're there, but speaking Arabic is not deemed important in the Bible. It's so why would the language of a nomadic desert people that really doesn't have any special significance, any spiritual import, why would that be necessary in order to transmit the wisdom of God? And Muhammad doesn't have a really good explanation for that. He he says it's an Arabic Quran for people who know, and by this he means people who speak Arabic. But again, this is one of those circular statements that you find in the Quran. There's no real coherent explanation for why this is important. But it also raises the question, like I said, if it is important, then why do you have English language Qurans? Why do you have people trying to communicate in English the importance of Islam and the importance of Muhammad? And why are these conversions considered valid? If a critique by Jay Smith or David Wood or Sam Shamoon or anyone who is not who does not speak Arabic, if that or whose language is not Arabic, if those critiques are not valid because they don't understand the textual meaning and they don't understand the nuance of Arabic language, then why is a conversion done by someone who does not speak Arabic? Why is that valid? What makes that legitimate? And the critiques of the Quran by people who speak English not legitimate? You have to ask the Muslims. You have to point out this inconsistency, this contradiction. So in verse 6 it says, "Say I am only a mortal like you. It is revealed to me that your God is one God." And this is true. There is one God, and this is emphasized in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. There is one God. That does not mean he's a Unitarian God. Therefore, follow the right way to him and ask and ask his forgiveness. And woe to the polytheists. And this is ironic because there are so many things, so many aspects of Islam, so many ritualistic aspects that are derived from polytheistic religions, from these pre-existing religions that Muhammad was surrounded by in the Arabian Peninsula and in his own tribe, the Quraysh. To those who do not give poor rate and are unbelievers in the hereafter, as for those who believe and do good, they shall surely have a reward to be cut off. Now, in the other video, I mentioned the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, and a lot of people interpret this as a parable and as some kind of statement that you have to do good works, or that salvation is somehow inherently tied to doing good works. In this case, charity and caring for the impoverished. Because, of course, in the parable, the Lazarus is at the door of the rich man, just begging for a scrap of food, a scrap of food that would be fed to the dogs, and the dogs are licking his wounds. He's suffering, he's starving, and then he dies and is welcomed into Abraham's bosom. And a lot of people interpret this as a message that this means you have to do good works in order to get into heaven. You have to give to the poor. And in Islam would interpret it in that way, that you have to give alms and that's why zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. But that's not the real message of that story, because as I said in the previous video, and as you know, he when Lazarus is when the rich man is finds him looks up and finds himself in hell and starts communicating with Abraham, he asks him to send someone, or send Lazarus back from the dead, send someone back from the dead to tell his brothers who are still alive and have the chance to repent. Send him to them, and they'll believe. And of course, Abraham says uh, they won't believe if someone's sent from the dead, if they don't believe the prophets. And that's the core of the message here. This was someone who obviously did not believe in the gospel, and the fact that the gospel was being delivered by God himself wouldn't have made a difference. So it was an allegory for Jesus, who would die, spend 3 days in the ground, and 3 days in the grave, and then be resurrected. So that's the core, that's the key point of this parable. It's not that the rich man was being punished for being avaricious and just being someone who didn't give alms. That was simply a reflection of the state of his heart, which was rejecting and was hard-hearted towards God, even though even though the rich man himself probably observed the Sabbath, and in terms of um, rituals would be considered uh, an observant Jew, and in fact he believed in Abraham and and presumably the prophets. He just didn't let their message change his heart. So I mean that's the main takeaway from that parable. It's not simply that if you don't give alms, or if you're impecunious with your wealth, that you'll be punished and sent to hell. But this is a key part of Islam, because it has a works-based soteriology. So giving the poor rate is emphasized to the exclusion of actually hearing the gospel, of actually believing in God and believing in Christ. So it says, "As for those who believe and do good, they shall surely have a reward never to be cut off." So this is a statement that is contradictory, and a lot of people don't realize that, particularly if they belong to a religion that's very works based. They say, well, you have to believe, but you also have to do good. But the second part of that negates the first part, because if doing good is part of salvation, if doing good works is part of salvation, then it's impossible to be saved. And this is illustrated by the life of Martin Luther. Eric Metaxas is a great biography of Martin Luther, where he describes him as a monk who belonged to the Augustinian order. And every day he would not every day, but he would routinely flay himself. He would confess for hours and hours, and after his confession, he would go back and then have to confess again for the sins that he hadn't remembered to confess. And it was just this endless cycle. And eventually Luther came to the realization that there was no amount of confession that would expiate his sins, that Christ had to be intercessor and had to forgive these sins in order for him to be saved. He realized that there was no amount of self-flagellation or confession or even prayer that could atone for for his sin, because he was born with that sin. He had that sin nature. It was inherited just by virtue of the fact that he was a human being. So that was what led to his epiphany, that salvation was by faith. So when you see here, you have to believe and do good. The second part of that statement is a negation of the first. It's a minimization and a diminution of the sacrifice that Christ made. If you say that you have to do something to add to Christ's sacrifice, then you're essentially negating the sacrifice altogether. So in verse 9, it says, "What? Do you indeed disbelieve in him who created the earth in 2 periods? And do you set up equals with him? This is the Lord of the worlds." In this is another case of the inconsistencies of the Quran, because at other points and in most points, and this is the one exception as far as I know, th- this is the one exception as far as I know, that that where he says he, and he's referring to Allah, created the world in 2 periods. Everywhere else he says it was created in 6 periods. Now again, this isn't the best translation of the Quran, but of course in Genesis, God creates the earth in 6 days. Now, I'm not sure if this is the 6 periods could be translated into 6 days. But the interesting thing here is it's not. He doesn't even say that God created the earth in 6 days. He says he created the earth in 2 days, or 2 periods, which is inconsistent even with the rest of the Quran. And you have to wonder where exactly where exactly this came in. Now, this is another Meccan surah, but it illustrates the inconsistency of the Quran. He doesn't know how long it took God to create the world, or the earth. He doesn't know. He doesn't know whether man was created from dust or clay, or a dust and clay, or whether he was created from a created from blood. There are all these things that contradict each other in the Quran. Sometimes within the very same surah, he'll make a statement that refutes a statement made earlier in that same surah. And this is just another one of those examples. "And he made it in mountains above its surface, and he blessed therein and made therein its foods in 4 periods, alike for the seekers." So this is him saying, the other 4 days were consumed by making mountains and foods, which I assume is a reference to animals, alike for the seekers. "Then he directed himself to the heaven, and it is a vapor. So he said to it in the earth, Come, willingly or unwillingly. They both said, We come willingly. So he ordained them 7 heavens in 2 periods, and revealed in every heaven its affair, and we adorned the lower heaven with brilliant stars and made it to guard. That is the decree of the mighty, the knowing." And this is another thing. The Quran, excuse me, the Quran does not specify which was created first, the heavens or the earth. Now it says in here, it says the 7 heavens. And this was something else that Muhammad believed, that there were literally seven different heavens, and you've all heard the phrase seventh heaven. In fact, I think there was a TV show with that title about a pastor, but Muhammad literally believed in seven heavens, but he also was confused as to what was created first, whether heaven was created first or earth. And this is interesting because he describes Adam and Eve in the garden and Iblis or Satan trying to deceive them, trying to deceive Eve. So you have to wonder what the progression there was. If Satan already existed, how could there be a heaven that was created after the earth? And this is another point in which Muhammad was very confused. Um, the seven heavens and the seven worlds are classical planets and the spheres that connect them. Yeah. Uh, yeah, exactly. But it's just an illustration of how disordered the thinking of Muhammad was, and the the thoughts of Islam. And because you don't if you read the Quran, you don't have any real concrete idea of when heaven was created in relationship to earth, what what happened in the garden and why it's important. So the idea of original sin, the idea of original sin is absent from Islam, which makes you wonder what's the point of Muhammad. Not only Muhammad, but any of the other prophets that he refers to and that he says he's in the same line as. Why are they necessary? If there was no original sin, then man wasn't separated from fellowship with God. There was no need to have this chain of prophets preaching the message of Allah if man was never separated from God. And you have to also wonder why Adam and Eve were banished from the garden to begin with, if there was no original sin, if this concept never existed in Islam. And this is one of the reasons Muslims believe that everyone from birth was a Muslim, and everyone by nature is good. So Muslims believe that everyone on earth is by nature good inherently. When they were born, they were simply corrupted by the word. And this is a complete inversion of the truth, which is that no one was born good, and there's no one good. And as Jesus tells the rich ruler, no one is good but God. God is the only good, perfect being, and no one in the world is good. They were all born with a sin nature, and that's the reason why they need the gospel and why they need Christ's sacrificial atonement. So this is a very, very understandable concept when you put these links together. But in Islam, it doesn't make any sense. So the idea that you need Muhammad to the idea that you need Muhammad and his message and need to read the Quran and revert to being a Muslim because Muslims believe that you're simply reverting to your default status, which is good, i.e., Muslim. The idea that you need Muhammad to do that, it simply doesn't make any sense. But because if there's no original sin, uh, why is it necessary? Why is it necessary to have someone um, explain this. Why is it necessary to have someone explain the need to worship Allah, the need to follow Muhammad? If there's no original sin, if man wasn't corrupted by sin, then you don't really need the gospel. Just like Adam and Eve before the fall need didn't need the gospel. They didn't need the message of Jesus because they had a perfect relationship with God and he could communicate to them directly. They didn't need an intercessor or someone to explain the message of salvation to them. So this is the seventh heavens. And in 13 it says, but if they turn aside, then say, I have warned you of a scourge like the scourge of Ad and Samud. And this is the reference to the Arabian tribes of the Hadrama and the Hejaz, respectively. These two tribes whose civilization vanished, and Muhammad repeatedly tries to imply that the reason they vanished is because of Allah and Allah's wrath, and these people were disobedient, therefore he punished them. But again, there's no concrete evidence he provides that Allah had anything to do with these tribes disappearing. Just like the fact that there aren't Sabians today. One of the reasons is because the Persian Empire and Muslims themselves eliminated this group. They basically whittled it down and then eliminated it altogether through warfare and conquest. And there are many groups there. If you go to Wikipedia, you can find an entire page of tribes that are extinct, human people groups that no longer exist. So, is Allah responsible for them disappearing too? Is Allah responsible for these tribes in North and South America and the Caribbean? Is he responsible for their disappearance? Why does Muhammad just single out Ad and Samud? Well, he does that because he's speaking to people who are steeped in Arabian culture and history, and they'll be familiar with these tribes which existed at one point. So in 15 it says, then as to Ad, they were unjustly proud in the land, and they said, who is mightier in strength than we? Did they not see that Allah, who created them, was mightier than they in strength? And they denied our communications. So we sent on them a furious wind in unlucky days, that we may make them taste the chastisement of abasement, of abasement in this world's life. And certainly the chastisement of the hereafter is much more, certainly the chastisement of the hereafter is much more abasing, and they shall not be helped. And to Samud, we show them the right way, but they chose error above guidance. So there overtook them the scourge of an abasing chastisement for what they earned. And we delivered those who believed and guarded against evil. And on the day that the enemies of Allah shall be brought together to the fire, then they shall be formed into two groups. Until when they come to it, their ears and their eyes and their skins shall bear witness against them as to what they did. And they shall say to their skins, why have you borne witness against us? They shall say, Allah, who makes everything speak, has made us speak, and he created you at first, and to him you shall be brought back. And you have to understand, this is all, Muhammad is interpreting this literally, just like when he says the sky is a canopy. He's not using poetic language. He means literally that's what the sky is. So here he's saying at the judgment seat, these people who rejected Islam, who rejected Muhammad, their skins and their ears and their eyes, their bodies will literally speak against them, have a voice, and speak against their evil deeds. So, I mean, it's really kind of absurd when you think about it. But I just want to compare this this passage, particularly when he's talking about Ad and how proud they were in the land. This actually does have a parallel in the Bible, and God does punish people for pride and self will. And um, the book of Obadiah is a great example. It's one of the shortest books in the Old Testament, but it's a great example of this, of God punishing and prophesying the destruction of Edom. So in verse 1, it says, the vision of Obadiah, thus saith the Lord concerning Edom, we have heard a rumor from the Lord, and an ambassador is sent among the heathen. Arise ye, and let us rise up against her in battle. Behold, I have made thee small among the heathen, thou art greatly despised. The pride of thine heart hath deceived thee, that thou dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, who shall bring me down to the ground? Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord. If thieves come to thee, if robbers by night, how art thou cut off? Would they not have stolen till they had enough? If the grape gatherers came to thee, would they not leave some grapes? How are the things of Esau searched out? How are his hidden things sought up? All the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee, that they eat thy bread, that they that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. There is none understanding in him. Shall I not in that day, saith the Lord, even destroy the wise men out of Edom, and understanding out of the mount of Edom? And thy mighty men, O Teman, shall be dismayed, to the end that every one of the mount of Esau may be cut off by slaughter. For thy violence against thy brother Jacob shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. And the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even wast as one of them. So they're basically being punished for participating in the plunder of in the plunder of Israel as they were being taken away in captivity, as they were being sent into exile. They participated in their plunder, and of course, Edom is the descendant of Esau, and Israel is the descendant of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. So this is one of the books that demonstrates God's wrath against prideful people, in this case, a prideful nation who don't believe that they need God's favor to survive, that they can rely on themselves, and they can just disregard God entirely. So there is a parallel in this sense, and I think Muhammad probably was aware of some of these things in the Bible, the prophets, the prophecies against nations and people who thought that they were sufficient, that they didn't have to rely or trust on God, like Nebuchadnezzar, for example, who was who was punished until eventually having his kingdom returned to him. So this is something you find in the Quran. I just want to mention that because it is an interesting parallel. But again, Muhammad is really misapplying this idea and using it for his own purposes, just like the idea of hell. And I contrasted the the hell depicted in the Bible and Scripture with the hell depicted by Muhammad, which resembles not so much the hell of the Bible, as a hell that you would find in Dante's Inferno, a work of poetry, or in classical Greek or Roman mythological works. So in 22 it says, "And you did not veil yourselves, lest your ears and your eyes and your skin should bear witness against you, but you thought that Allah did know most of what you did." And now this is an interesting verse because it has a double meaning, and the less the understated meaning here is when you think of Islam and you think of veiling, you particularly associate it with women who are compelled to wear the hijab, or in Iran, the chador. You have to wear the chador and have to wear it properly, otherwise you're going to be arrested. And in Saudi Arabia, women who wear the abaya, but also many of them wear the niqab, where you can only see the woman's eyelids. So veiling, the idea of veiling is associated, very deeply associated with Islam, particularly unmarried women, or women who are um, women who are single are supposed to wear this veil. And depending upon how you interpret it, in the Quran it says to cover your to cover yourself with overgarments, or cover um your beauty or treasure with. So this could be interpreted in a number of ways. The most extreme interpretation of course is wearing something like the niqab or the burqa, which in which you can't really see the woman's eyes, or if you see their eyes, the only thing you can see is their eyes, and you can't see any of their face. So even though um, this is in the context of judgment, it does have a practical application, just like when Muhammad uses parables involving slavery or a slave. You have to understand that these weren't just just allegorical. They didn't serve just an allegorical function, talking about following Islam or obeying Muhammad and Allah. They had a practical application in the sense that slavery was endemic to Islam, and it needed slavery to persist, and it needed a servile class, both as slaves but also as second class citizens. So Jews and Christians had to pay the jizya, which supported Muslim expansion and supported the bureaucracy of the Islamic State, the Caliphate. They needed to bankroll that. But there was also a there were literal slaves who served as the backbone of the Islamic Empire. So you had the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, the Mamelukes in Egypt, who stopped the Mongols. So these were slave classes that eventually became integrated into society. Some of them posing such a threat that they were restricted. Eventually, the Ottomans allowed recruitment of Janissaries from non-Muslims. Originally, they were just young Christians from places like the Balkans who were enslaved and trained to be a warrior class. So here, when you see things like veiling, or when you see things like veiling discussed in the context of judgment, or slavery, parables about slavery, you have to understand that there's a real world application to these things. And veiling is important in Islam. It's because most Muslim countries operate within an honor-based culture. So when you hear things like honor killings, there was just a Muslim woman who was killed in my own borough, Staten Island. She was left. She ran a nonprofit, I believe, for domestic violence victims who were Middle Eastern and South Asian, predominantly Muslim women who were victims of domestic violence, and she was just found dead. Now, it's not clear who killed her, but it wouldn't be shocking if it was her partner or her husband, whom I think she sought a restraining order against. Um, but this is not uncommon, and this is the culture, the honor culture, and veiling is an integral part of that. In order to police your honor, you have to restrict the movements of your wife, your sister, your extended family, all the women in your extended family. And this is why you see even little girls as young as 5 or 6, uh, prepubescent girls who were forced to wear headscarves and cover their hair. Um, so I just finished reading the great. Okay. Um, so I just wanted to mention that to bring that up, the fact that these things like veiling, slavery, there's a reason why these terms are used, and it's not just it, it, it's not just to convey a metaphor about how Muhammad believe how Muhammad thinks you should act, or how he thinks you should believe. They do have real world applications in Islam. So in 25 it says, "And we have appointed for them comrades, so they have made fair seeming to them what is before them and what is behind them, and the word proved true against them among the nations of the jinn and the men that have passed away before them, that they shall surely be losers. And those who disbelieve say, do not listen to this Quran and make noise therein. Perhaps you may overcome. Therefore, we will most certainly make those who disbelieve taste a severe punishment, and we will most certainly reward them for the evil deeds they used to do. That is the reward of the enemies of Allah. The fire for them therein shall be the house of long abiding, a reward for their denying our communications. And those who disbelieve will say, our Lord, show us those who led us astray from among the jinn, and the men, that we may trample them under our feet, so that they may be of the lowest. As for those who say, our Lord is Allah, then continue in the right way. The angels descend upon them, saying, fear not, nor be grieved, and receive good news of the garden which you were promised. And this is another thing about the Quran, the introduction of jinn, who are, it's hard to describe, but they're basically celestial creatures that existed in Arabic culture before Muhammad, and that Muhammad appropriated for his purposes. So the idea of jinn already existed, and he used them as a counterpart in various ways to celestial creatures, but also demons. So there were, in Islam there are good jinn and bad jinn, depending upon their purpose. But more often than not, when they're being referred to, they're being referred to as some sort of corrupting influence. And this is why in a lot of Muslim cultures, you find soothsayers and and um, and clairvoyance and people who promise to to find a way to rid you of jinn or evil spirits, demonic forces. And this is a huge business in many parts of the Islamic world, and even in places like the United States, where you have a large Muslim minority. And in fact, if you pick up a paper like AM New York or New York Metro, you'll find ads at the very back of the paper. You'll find all of these ads from African and South Asian mystics promising to solve problems in your life by getting rid of evil spirits, getting rid of things that plague you. It's kind of similar to the stuff you see here with mediums and psychics, but they actually promise not only to tell your future, but to actually intervene and rid you of spirits. And this is huge in certain cultures. I mentioned the book by V.S. Nepal, Beyond Belief, and there's it's divided into 4 parts: Indonesia, Pakistan, Iran, and Malaysia. And in Indonesia, he describes the syncretism between all of these animistic folk religions, and pantheistic religions and Islam, and how these beliefs persisted persisted throughout, despite the attempts by more austere Muslim scholars to rid the country of these things. And I think it's very difficult because in Islam itself, there's this mystical pagan quality that persisted even after Muhammad arrived on the scene. And you can see it with the references to jinn. Jinn is something that is omnipresent in some places, like Indonesia, but also some Muslim parts of North Africa and West Africa. This idea that there are celestial creatures that are constantly involved in your affairs and doing things in your life. They're not angels. They're not quite demons, but they're celestial creatures that are always interfering in your life and doing things to you. And this is something you find referenced throughout the Quran. Now, I mentioned that book, and I'm just gonna end with a quote from Beyond Belief by V.S. Nepal, and he's talking about Imaduddin, who is one of the central figures in this part of the book, an Indonesian who fled Indonesia, who fled Suharto, the president governing, or the leader of Indonesia, and returned later on under the same leader and collaborated with one of his deputies, Habibi, on this aerospace engineering project. So V.S. Nepal is talking about this man, and he says it was the perfection of the value system, and that's in closing quotes, of his Islam. It was curiously circular. It was adopting his preacher's analogy, like a very smooth and easy treadmill rather than a car. It kept him busy and went nowhere. Even if you said to him that people in Iowa, and this was where he stayed in exile, he worked at the University of Iowa, had been kind to him when he was in need. He was prompted to say nothing about the people. Their kindness was simply another tribute to his faith. God, he said, loved him very much. And as I was explaining earlier, this was something that is a recurring theme in the Quran. Muhammad continually attributing everything to Allah, both good and bad, and saying that Allah is the one responsible for this. Even things that he that knowingly took from the Bible, which doesn't have any reference to Allah, he's going to attribute those to Allah. And this is a prevalent mindset in much of the Islamic world, the idea that everything that can be attributed to Allah. So the kindness Emma Duden was shown by Christian faculty, or the hospitality he was shown in the United States, is not something that he should be grateful for. It's an example of Allah being beneficent to him. And this is a recurring theme throughout the Quran, the idea that Allah is the one who's responsible for everything, but no explanation of why. So Allah is doing this and this and that, but when you probe Muhammad for proof, he doesn't provide any. And in fact, he says that questioning him is a sign of unbelief. So I just wanted to read that short little paragraph from a really fascinating book. Like I said, Beyond Belief by V.S. Nepal. This is the follow-up to his book, Among the Believers, his travels through 4 non-Arab Muslim countries. So I didn't get to finish Surah 41, but I'll finish it in my next video. Glad everyone who joined, Mark, Andrew, John, GW, I don't know if he's still here, Love and Light, everyone who joined, thank you, and I'll finish this surah in my next video.